All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Kaitlyn, and I am an ambassador for the Center for Open Science. And so today I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about some of the services that the Center for Open Science has to offer, more specifically with respect to the Open Science Framework. As I'm sure you guys have heard of today and also maybe in your own fields, you know, this idea of transitioning to more open science has been quite a hot topic across disciplines. So I'm in psychology, it's huge in my area, also in like cancer biology, economics, you name it. Today I would like to show you how the Open Science Framework can help you sort of transition into this more open science and how you can be a more productive researcher using these tools. So since I wasn't here today, I actually don't know where we're on in this thing, so I'm going to skip that one. So just also says a little bit of a background from me. So I am a PhD student in my third year. I am a social personality psychologist, and I study goal pursuit and how people attain their goals over time. So a lot of the data that I work with, it's kind of larger data sets. I do multi-level longitudinal designs, but I also have background in experimental, a little bit of mixed methods. So if you have any questions about any type of method, feel free to ask me about that along the way, and I can speak to something more specifically as you see fit. So just as a bit of an outline, so we'll first talk about briefly what is the Center for Open Science. Then we'll go over kind of like a quick and dirty tutorial of the Open Science Framework, how to get started, how to organize your materials, things like that. And then we'll transition to the different types of registration templates that the Open Science Framework offers. And then if we have some time, and this is where I think we can kind of learn the most, is I have some FAQs that have these are kind of some of the common concerns that have come up in the discussions I've had on open science. So for example, what do you do in particular cases, like with secondary data, things like that. So we can talk more about specific cases at that time. So what is the Center for Open Science? At its core, the Center for Open Science is founded on three fundamental principles, which is openness, integrity, and reproducibility. Something that's really stuck with me that I heard Brian Nosek talk about 3 years ago at APS, so it's a conference in psychology. His philosophy was that the Center for Open Science is created by the community for the community. And so really the Center for Open Science is geared toward developing new tools that can help researchers, as well as studying things like meta-science. And so at its core we have infrastructure, community, and meta-science. So for example, the Center for Open Science has developed a variety of software tools like the Open Science Framework. There's also the community, so there's ambassadors like me that go out and train other researchers on these more open science practices. But then the Center for Open Science is also affiliated with different institutions, journals, funders, things like that. And then they also focus on meta-science, which is basically just studying scientific practices. So for example, you might have heard about a more recent paper by Kidwell, who looked at the effectiveness of badges in journals. But today, because we have a limited amount of time, we're going to talk about infrastructure, specifically with the Open Science Framework. And so here you can kind of follow along as you see fit. Otherwise, you can I have it kind of like mimicked so that the website is mimicked in my slide. So choose however you see fit. If you want to follow along, it's osf.io. It's probably the simplest URL you'll ever find. So with the Open Science Framework, it can help with things like project management. You can easily share files. You can document project changes. You can look at your project analytics, archive data, which is what we were just talking about before. And you can also do things like pre-registration. And so we'll delve in now. So like I said, osf.io if you want to follow along. So when you log in, this is the website you'll see. You just sign in as you may have already done before. And so here, once you sign in, you're presented with the dashboard. And this is sort of like what you've done recently. This is usually the list of your most recent projects. So here, the ambassadors page is constantly being updated, so that's usually always at the top of my list. So if someone adds, like if a collaborator adds some new files, that'll get moved to the top of the list. But if you click on, so that's the general overview. And so if you want to create a new project, so this is where I'm going to probably focus the most in terms of the Open Science Framework, is how do you create a project, how do you organize your files, things like that. So if you go to right there at the top and click Create New Project, it's quite simple. You just add a title for your project. It can be something like the title of your paper, Study 1 of X project, whatever you want to name it. You can give it a brief project description, and once you start getting more into the Open Science Framework, you can actually start developing templates so that you can just click a previous one that you saved before and kind of save the work in setting things up. And so once you create a project, you get to this page here. And so as it stands now, this is a very blank slate. And so how I like to think of the Open Science Framework is kind of like a file drawer, but the good kind. So here, like I said, it's a blank slate, and so it's up to you to sort of fill it up with different folders and components, more particularly, that relate to your project. And so you can do it however you see fit, depending on your organization style. So if you want to add a folder, that translates to what we call a component. And so if you click just right here, there's a box for components. Just click Add Component. And there's a drop-down menu of the different types of components that are already pre-existing, but you can also create your own. So for example, one you might start off with is like maybe your hypotheses and your analytic strategy. You could also, again, write a description, things like that. And then once you create that, you get the folder within the Open Science, within the project. So we have the project, which is the overarching sort of file drawer, and then you have the individual folder within that. In this case, we're looking at the hypotheses, for example. And so within each of these, you can also edit different functions. So we have, for example, there's a wiki there. It's on this side. It's always at the top left-hand corner. There you can write things. I usually put more like descriptive information there. So for example, I might, if it's for a poster that I've presented, I might put the abstract there, list like, this poster was presented at this conference, or if it was like an honors student's project, I'll put this was the project of this person. You can pretty much put whatever you want there. And so how do you actually get the documents into your folder now? And so at least if you're working on a Mac, it's really simple and intuitive. You essentially just drag and drop. And once you drag and drop in the file, it just appears in your file folder, and then it's there for you to access whenever you like. And so this is great because one of the really big benefits of the Open Science Framework is that it tracks or timestamps everything that you put in there. So for example, when I uploaded this, it gives the exact date and the exact time that happened. And then if you add new revisions, it'll update that accordingly. And I'll show you how to update them as well. So once you've uploaded a file, you can actually view that file within the Open Science Framework. So here I uploaded a Word document, and so once you click on View, or if you double click the file as well, that file will show up, and so you can see the document on the Open Science Framework. You can also add revisions of that document. So if you, let's say you decided to change around your hypotheses or whatever, you can drag in the same, as long as the file is the same name, just drag it back in and it will update accordingly. So if I had replaced this one, I click simply revisions, and then you can see here both of the files that I've submitted. So this first one, labeled 1, is the original, and number 2 is the updated version, and you can go back and download the older version. So if someone else, if you're collaborating with someone, you can go back to whatever you did or see what your collaborator updated, things like that. So one of the biggest questions that I get with the Open Science Framework is about peer reviews. So say you want to upload your hypotheses, you upload your analytic strategy, whatever it may be, and you want to share them with reviewers. But clearly sometimes this process is supposed to be anonymous, so what do you do then? Well, here you can actually create a privacy control. You have some privacy controls, and you can create a private link that that anonymizes your project. So you can create, if you go to contributors, So there you can also add your co-authors. That's pretty intuitive, so I'll skip that bit. But you just click like, add contributors and search for people. So if you want to create a view-only link that's anonymized, you click this section here. So it says view-only links. And so you click add, and then this little box pops up. And so you can name the link whatever you want. So you could say like peer review at Psych Science or something like that. And then you can choose which components you want to share in this link. So you can share the entire project, or you can share, for example, just the hypothesis if you're not ready to share your data or something like that yet. And so you give that access, and then you click the anonymize function here. And so what that says is that this ensures that the wiki pages, the files, the registration forms, and add-ons do not contain any identifying information. But there's a caveat here, because I've actually done this mistake myself. If you upload Word documents or PDFs, don't put your name, because those don't get anonymized. So it only anonymizes, so for example, if we go back here, it'll remove this piece, it'll just like block out my name. But if I put it, say, in this file, because I usually put like the title of my project and the collaborators, that doesn't get anonymized, so you have to be careful with that. But otherwise, you can create anonymized links, so that way you can still maintain your privacy during peer review. Okay. So in terms of more general navigation, if you click on, so this is the dashboard, like I said before, this is where you will see the more recent projects that you've had or that people have accessed within your own project box. So if you click on My Projects, you get a more detailed view of all the projects that you have. As you can see here, you can get quite a lot, and it can get kind of messy if you don't take care of it. Because this also not only shows the different projects, but it also sometimes shows the different components. So you can kind of see in these symbols here. So like these little boxes are components, whereas like this little circle thing, or sorry, this little box is a project, and this little circle thing here is representing a component. And so how do you keep all of this organized? Here, you have something called collections. This is one option. So you can actually group different projects together. So for example, I always put my conference presentations on the Open Science Framework. So I have basically a subfolder that says these are all my conference presentations. And so I can click on that, and then only my conference presentation shows up. And so it kind of helps declutter your project box a little bit. You can also use tags. I'm starting to use these more recently, but I think they're actually a fun little tool to kind of also help declutter your project box. Here you can tag within your project or component. You can add like little tags. So you can say like have like a shortened version of your study and put like methods. So if you want to say I want to find the method or the analytic plan for project 1, you can tag project 1 and methods. Click both of them, and only those will pop up. So for example, here, if I click on just one of the tags, like because I study goals, I have a tag goal pursuit, only that project comes up. And so that's another way to kind of keep track of that. And so the tags come up here, show up here. So as I clicked on goal pursuit, that shows up here. And then you can also add other layers. So like I said, if you want to look for the analytic strategy for project 1, click on both of those tags. Both tags will pop up here, and then you can kind of further go through your projects that way. Just as a quick note though, some people, this is a great tool, I think, both the tags and the collections, but one thing is that, this is one of the criticisms I've heard, it's kind of more on the minor side, is that for these collections, if you start putting a lot of them here, so say if I had like a dissertation here, if you have a lot of collections, it'll start where you have to kind of like filter through them. So here it says like 1 out of 15 pages. So you also kind of have to flip through pages. So some people find that a little bit annoying. To me, that's more on the minor side. If you are kind of annoyed by that, the tags might be a better option for you. Yeah.
Just to clarify, the tags would have to be specified in the title of the project.
So if you, not in the title, but there's different boxes here. So there's like a tag for every page. So for a project page or for a component page, you just type in the tag, and I think if you click like tab or something, it'll create a new tag for you. So the tags are completely customizable. You can name it however you want. Like I said, you can kind of use them to kind of compound one another to further organize your project box. Okay. So one great thing, or another great thing, because there's many great things about the Open Science Framework, is that you can work with simple Word documents or PDFs, but you can also connect the Open Science Framework with tools that you might already be using. So for example, if you actively use Google Drive, then that might be something that would be applicable to you. So you can actually import, for example, your Google Drive documents directly into the Open Science Framework. It's also connected to things like Dropbox, which I religiously use, GitHub, which I think some people were talking about a little bit before, things like that. And there's also going to be more upcoming features as well. I don't know exactly when, but the ultimate goal is to kind of expand into these more, or these programs that people use already in their daily life. Because as I kind of said before, ultimately, the goal of the Center for Open Science is to create tools that are beneficial to you as researchers. And so if you ever have any suggestions about things like that, don't be afraid to contact the team and be like, hey, why don't you add this component or something like that? I'm sure they would love to hear feedback like that. So does anyone have any questions on how to operate the Open Science Framework? I kept it very brief, just to kind of get you started. But like I said, it's more of, if you approach it from more of a file drawer where you just kind of like organize your different projects, you can customize it in any way that you see fit. So whether you want to have a project be a single study, you can have one project be an entire paper. The way you organize it is totally up to you. And so does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah.
So when you upload a new file,
Yeah.
does it store it like in a cloud or somewhere?
So, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, don't quote me on it, but I believe there is like a system with Open Science Framework where they have servers where everything's backed up onto that. So I don't know, unless like you have like Google Drive or something like that, but I'm pretty sure there's like an Open Science Framework network or server where all of that's housed. And I know there's definitely something in the details of it, because I know, say, for example, if tomorrow the Open Science Framework or the Center for Open Science just decided not to exist, like there are some safety precautions built in. I don't know the exact details off the top of my head, but basically say they lost all their funding tomorrow, like you still have protection for up to like, I think 5 years or something like that. So the Open Science Framework will operate for a very long time and protect all of your files.
What is so let's say if I register,
Yeah.
what is my data allowance, or what is the space I get?
I don't know the details of that, but it's very large, because for example, with the ambassador, so there's the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. It's kind of like a newer organization. For example, they literally just ran their annual conference out of the Open Science Framework exclusively. So throughout this conference, like we were like building different projects, probably like 200 people were working on it. You probably can't get more than what they were doing. So I wouldn't really worry about the space issues. I don't know the exact limit, but I don't think you have to worry about that unless like you have like really big data, maybe like super large like Twitter files or something. I don't think you have to worry about space issues. Yeah.
So if you wanted to add like a Dropbox folder into your OSF project, how would you do that?
I don't have slides on that one. So, but there's the
I just did it.
because I don't know how to explain it without the screen.
It took a second, but you have to go to the settings of the
Yeah.
Project that you created, and then there's a way to add add-ons.
Yeah, you have to add add-ons, and so there's a list of add-ons. So that's where you have to like select which ones you want to sort of use. So there's the Google Drive, things like that, Dropbox. So if you navigate through the settings and like you have to manually add in or like opt into those, and then you should be able to connect your folders that way. I can show you that bit later on, but I don't have that as part of
And
this.
if I were to do something and then save it into that Dropbox folder, all those updates would then be incorporated into
Yes.
it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so does anyone else have questions about the Open Science Framework and how it works? Yes,
I have a question about security, but
Sure.
I don't know if you're taking questions later, I can ask later.
we can talk about it now, sure.
So my organisation is just getting new accreditation with the ISO system, which is about security. And basically, like, this looks like a really good thing, but I know I would only be able to use it if it was secure enough, according to these regulations that we have.
Yeah.
Because if not, we're liable to be sued if anything
Yeah.
happens. So I looked at your privacy policy and I couldn't see the information I needed. I emailed, I didn't get a response.
Okay, yeah.
I want to know, like, who has the right to the data? How can you assure us that, like, what's going to happen if, for example, this gets hacked? Like, so I know you have this kind of private versus public.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you guys have got my data, and therefore, even though I've said it as private, you still have my data.
Yes.
And I want to know, like, if I decide to delete my data, how long are you going to store it? Like Facebook, for example, it's nearly impossible to get rid of the data once you've given it to
Yeah.
them. So I want to know, what's your stance on that?
So I don't know that level of detail, but I do know that you still own your data. Like, the Open Science Framework does not own your data. So I would assume if you do delete it, I mean, there's probably some protocol with technology where it might maintain in some cloud for a little bit, but at the end of the day, you own your data. They cannot take my understanding is that they cannot take your data and use it without your knowledge. And depending on the type of information like you're talking about, because I do talk a little bit about like sensitive information later on, but that's more in the context of like research and participant data. So like if you have like highly identifiable information. So for one example that I've seen recently was like there's a program in a predominantly white school, and it's a predominantly white engineering department, but there's like the 2 African American students, and so if you just post that, even if you don't have their name, like you know who they are, and so I think there's some ways around that kind of issue, but in terms of like this more high-level security, I would have to ask the Open Science Framework people about that, because I only know I don't know much beyond what like the policies on the website say for that, so I'm sorry. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. So now we'll transition into the different types of pre-registrations that exist on the Open Science Framework. And then I'll also walk you through one of the more basic ones that I've done recently. Then I can talk about different options depending on the types of pre-registration you guys are interested in. So I'm sure you guys have heard about these different open science practices. Are you all familiar with like this badge system with like sharing so there's pre-registration, so the idea of pre-registering your hypotheses before you actually analyze your data. There's also sharing your materials, so making your research materials open to anyone who wishes to access them, particularly those who are interested in replicating your results or your study. And then there's open data, so that's where you make your data available publicly for other people to analyze it as they see fit. And so with pre-registration, the one practice that is most prevalent here is with pre-registration. So with pre-registration, the idea again is that you you register hypotheses, you make your hypotheses known before you collect data and or before you actually analyze your data. And so I won't get into the term of p-hacking or anything like that because I think that might be a little bit too much. But so what does this really mean? So how do we pre-register our studies? And so what does this also mean? So with the Open Science Framework, a registration creates a frozen version of the project that can never be edited or deleted, but it can be withdrawn. So once you officially pre-register a study, there's always going to be a record at some level that you pre-registered that study. And so if you just leave it as is, there will be a document, which I'll show you in a few minutes, that lists all of your information that you pre-registered, and that information is up to you. Like I said, we'll get that into a second. However, if you choose to withdraw that project, there basically will be like a shell. So it'll take away all the documents that you submitted, but it'll have like the timestamp of when you withdrew it. You can also have an option where you justify why you withdrew a project or things like that. So at the core, the idea of pre-registration is that once you do it, it's out there, but you can customize it in different ways. And so with the Open Science Framework, there are a few different types. So at its most basic is the open-ended registration. This is literally just a blank box. You can put in whatever this box you want. If you want to put in your hypotheses, it's really up to you what you want to put in there. There's also the As Predicted pre-registration template. So As Predicted is actually a website where you can also pre-register your hypotheses independently of the Open Science Framework, but they've worked together to come up with this template. And it's a bit more guided. So there are 8 questions. So it asks things like, did you already collect your data? Yes or no? What is your question or hypothesis? Describe your key variables. How did you come up with your sample size? Things like that. So it's a bit more of a guided pre-registration. There's also the Open Science Framework Standard Registration. This is pretty much the same as the open-ended registration, except it just adds 3 additional questions. So in addition to the blank box, it also asks you, was your data collected, yes or no? Have you looked at that data, yes or no? And then you make any additional comments. So basically get a couple blank boxes. And then there's a few other specialized types of registration. So there's the pre-registration challenge. I'll go into that a little bit. If you're interested in doing a replication, there's a special template for that you can use. And then there's also pre-registration in social psychology based on some guidelines by some experts in the field. So I'll walk you through pretty much these 3, and then we'll go through an example that I've actually done. So in addition to all of these official pre-registrations, something that I do in my own work is I actually create a dynamic document of my own registration, because like I said, when you create these registrations, they're frozen, you can't edit them. But in science, especially as a student like me, we make mistakes. So how do we fix that? And so with these dynamic documents, I basically start off with a template of my pre-registration. Basically, whatever I put in my official registration, I put into a Word document. Then I upload that to the Open Science Framework as a Word document, as I showed you before. And then as the study progresses, I might add in different comments saying, oh, I changed the way I computed this variable. Just basically, it's sort of like it's like an online lab notebook. So as you're going throughout your study, you just make little notes of the things that you've encountered, things you've updated, things like that. And so here we'll go through the different registration options. So within your particular project, so if you go to any project folder that you create, there's a little tab that says registrations, and then that opens up to this page, and this just kind of explains what the registrations are, as I explained before. You click new registration, and then you choose which one you want to do. And so I'll walk you through each of these. So for the first one, we'll go through the open-ended registration. So as I said, it's literally just a blank box. Like if you click an open-ended registration, this is what you see. It is totally up to you what you add. So if it's just your hypothesis, that's great. You can go into detail about your analytic plan. With this option, it's totally up to you what you want to register. And then this is what the as predicted one looks like. So this, like I said, this one's a bit more guided. So here it has the question, has your data been collected for this study already? Yes or no? So this might actually be a good one, for example, if you've already collected your data or using secondary data analysis, if you're doing secondary data analysis, because you can actually indicate like, yes, this data has already been collected, but this is what I'm going to test, even though I've already collected it. This is also could be used if, for example, you register before you analyze your data, but not before you run the study. So there's different stages where you can register your project. So the probably most efficient way is to register your project before you actually run the study and collect your data. So that's when you list out your methods, your hypotheses, and your analytic strategy, then you collect your data. That's probably the prime method. But sometimes things don't work out that way. Sometimes we use secondary data. Sometimes we don't have maybe the ideas formulated well enough, and so we're start writing the study. But then once we figured it out, we can pre-register before we actually analyze that data. So here you can actually indicate that in this template. So like I said, you can say, no, I have not collected my data. Yes, you have. Then you just explain your hypotheses. You can also list things like how many conditions you'll have and how people will be assigned. Which analyses will you do to address those exact hypotheses, and then if you have any secondary analysis. So one interesting note about the Open Science Framework is that when you pre-register a study, you can actually sometimes get feedback from people in the Open Science Framework. So if something doesn't match up, for example, they'll ask you to clarify something. So if, say you list 3 hypotheses, but you don't have an analysis that directly matches that, then they can kind of catch that for you to help you kind of really clarify your registration. And so that's just more questions about that. And then this is just what the OSF standard one looks like. So again, just the blank box plus the couple extra questions. So again, did you collect your data, yes or no? Have you looked at the data, yes or no? I don't have the full details on this, or I don't have the walkthrough through this, because this is actually quite a long one, but the Center for Open Science has been promoting this pre-registration challenge, and here the idea is that if you pre-register your study, particularly before you collect your data, you have the option to win $1,000. The whole promotion behind this is that we really want people to try out pre-registering their work. And so this is one of the incentives that they're using to kind of help facilitate that process. And so if you pre-register your study following this particular protocol, before you collect your data, then you collect your data, you write up your results, and then if you publish that study in in one of the eligible journals, there's tons of eligible journals across multiple fields, so you can check that out for yourselves. Once you get that study published, it doesn't matter what the findings are, as long as it gets published in one of the journals, you'll win $1,000. I will say though that and I'm not saying this just because I'm an ambassador, I have recently done this myself, and I think this pre-registration challenge can be beneficial, especially for newer scientists, because the protocol is a bit longer than the ones that I just showed you. Those are all very basic, maybe just a couple questions, 8 questions at most. This one is a lot more in-depth. You get a lot more feedback from the people at the Open Science Framework on this challenge. But there's a whole list of guided questions that you can find online. It's a few pages long. I wouldn't do it for every study, but I would recommend everybody do it at least once, because it really challenges the way you think about science, because it really encourages you to think about your study up front and think about all the specific details up front rather than waiting for it to happen, later on when you're finally starting to analyze your data and you realize, oh, I should have had this exclusion criteria. It really makes you think about science in a really interesting and unique way, and so I would highly encourage people to check it out. Even if you don't officially do the pre-registration challenge, definitely check out the documents for it. So, does anyone have any questions about the different types of pre-registration before we go through the example? Okay. So this is an example of an as-predicted registration that I've done relatively recently. It's a very basic study. I was just trying to validate some measures. And so I'll kind of show you my personal take on this. But as I said, it's a very customizable process. And so my philosophy in general is that the more you do up front, the more time you save later on. But so you can have a lot of details in your pre-registration. So you can have sometimes you can have a little bit less information depending on your own style. But I tend to be on the more heavily informational side up front. So this was a study that I did this summer. I pre-registered it before I collected the data, so that's the option that I selected. And so what's the main question? In this example, the purpose of the study was to examine whether these 2 items that I was interested in actually assessed what they're supposed to be measuring. So in this case, it was approach motivation and avoidance motivation. So approach motivation is pursuing goals for the more positive outcomes versus like avoiding the negative consequences of your goals. Does that make sense? And so we were just testing, does this approach item correlate with the approach condition? Does the avoidance item match up with the avoidance condition? Very basic study. So that's what the hypothesis was. So we just wrote them out very clearly. Then we just did a couple paired symbols t-tests. Basically just wrote that out, very simple. Secondary analysis, we had some extra things that we just kind of like threw in there. So we were interested in like the correlations among the different items. Nothing too crazy. And we can also talk about the exploratory analyses. With the exploratory analyses, you can go in as much detail or as little detail as you want. Because even if you write in some exploratory analyses, they're still going to be exploratory. They're no different than if you don't write them, in my opinion. So even if you don't put them there, you can still test them. Just mark them as exploratory. That's kind of important. So one of the key differences with like exploratory and confirmatory is that, if with pre-registration, you can say, my primary questions were I want to confirm those. Those are my confirmatory tests. Anything in the exploratory ones, just you have to label them like that. Just kind of keep that clear. And then you just justify your sample size. So, I just did a very basic power analysis using G-power. And then I just explained my exclusion criteria. So in this case, I had people write about 2 goals. If they didn't write about one of those goals, and they got excluded because it was within person design. So if they didn't write about one of the goals, it was useless. So you can kind of like list out all these different details in this registration. But I will say, just to show you a little bit of the flexibility, and this is why I kind of like this particular pre-registration, is that for the exclusion criteria, we actually didn't know what to expect, because for this task, we just had people write about any goal that they wanted to. And so, for example, we didn't know what to expect in terms of like what would be a valid response. And so we literally just wrote, we don't know what to expect. So we will look at the data or look at the goals that people write and then take notes on what we will exclude before we analyze it. And that's where like the dynamic document comes into play. So when I was looking through the goals, I was able to say, oh, well, this probably shouldn't be there. So for example, if people wrote about the same goal twice, then I wanted to remove them because they're not following the task instructions. And that's not something that I thought about in advance. And so with this dynamic document, I was able to say this new addition that I added to my pre-registration. And so you can be really flexible even in your pre-registration. That's my point. And so just a little bit more about this dynamic document. So like I said, this is just based on my own personal strategy here. You can upload it or kind of implement it in any way you see fit. I just use a simple Word document. And like I said, it's kind of just like your online lab notebook. You just update it as the research happens. Like I said, you can use your registration as a template and just like sort of track those changes. I typically use like a different color. So say my favorite color is green, I usually make my changes in green, things like that. So just something that's very clear cut, very detailed. This was what I originally said, this is what I changed. And as I kind of been going on about throughout this talk is the more detailed you are in the registration, the more time you save later on. I'm not sure if the idea of like registered reports have come up, but basically the more detail you put into your pre-registration, for example, if you put more detail into your method section, that'll be a lot easier to write your method section later on. So depending on how ambitious I decide to be with a particular project, sometimes I might just write the method section up front. Sometimes I won't do that. So obviously the more work you put in up front, the less you do later. And so as I've been saying, you just report any deviations that you make in this dynamic document. And so what does this dynamic document actually entail? What you put into that is completely up to you. This is just some suggestions of the strategies that I use. So I usually put a few bullet points of a background. So like, why am I doing this study? What's the rationale for this study? Usually very bullet points, maybe just put some key references. I list my research questions, which you have to do in the registration anyways. Then I map on to those specific hypotheses. Maybe I'll list some potential exploratory analyses, if I have them in the top of my mind. like I said just a minute ago, depending on how ambitious I am, I'll write a full method section, or sometimes I'll just put a paragraph of what I did. And then your analytics strategy. So as you can see here, most of these are already built into the registration. I just fluff it up a little bit more to make things a little bit easier. And so one way that I kind of sell it to students, so if anyone has students or going to conferences and things like that, that rush, there's a deadline for the upcoming conference, and oh, it's due tomorrow, and I haven't thought about what I want to do. So then you just kind of like quickly analyze something. If you pre-register that, you can kind of like keep yourself organized, and then when you actually make that poster 6 months later, all the information's already there, so you don't have to remember like what did I do 6 months ago when I wrote that abstract. So not only does it kind of keep yourself in check and sort of keeping yourself organized, it can actually help you be a more efficient researcher later on. It'll save you time, keep you more organized, and then if you are a student, it helps to impress your supervisor, because then they think you're super organized. It's really great. So yeah. So within the last, I guess, does anyone have any questions about the dynamic documents? Okay. So this is where I think it's really the more fun part, is sort of getting into the questions or sort of demystifying common misconceptions about open science and pre-registration. And so here I just have a few different common questions that I get asked, but I'd be very curious if you have others as well. So some of the common concerns, so I have the questions, and then I also have just some of my own opinions on the matter. So one that I always get is, do I have to make my data, materials, etc. public? Do you? No. So with the Open Science Framework, I didn't really mention this yet, but you can choose to make your project public or private. By default, everything is private until you elect to make it public. Even if you do an official pre-registration, you can put an embargo of up to 4 years on that project. So that way you can keep all of your materials private if that's what you wish to do. And then you can also make, kind of customize the different components. So if you want to make the project public, but say just like the data component private, you can do that. So you can make individual components private as well. Another common question, we sort of touched upon this a little bit, but not to your level. So what if you have sensitive data? So you have like specialized populations, or maybe you study. So one that's come up is like the person studied relationships, and so there's obvious linkage between the two partners' responses. So like, what do you do in these cases? Or like maybe you've collected email addresses and you need them for whatever reason. What do you do in these cases? And so with this, I've been thinking a lot about this actually, because I also collect a lot of personal information. One thing that you can potentially do is to consider sharing a file, like a data file that that has everything except of the sensitive information. And then you can have a more complete variable list on the Open Science Framework. So, you have just the data that's not sensitive, and then you have a list of all the variable names, or the variables that you have. And then should someone want that, they can request the additional variables from you. That's just something that I've been sort of playing around with. So that way you're still open to some extent, but you're keeping you're protecting your participants' confidentiality. Another big one, especially in my field within personality, that comes up is, what if I have a large data set that I'm not finished using? So say I've collected, 80 variables, and I've only examined a hypothesis with like 5 of them. Am I supposed to like upload my entire data set and get scooped? So that's totally up to you. One suggestion that I've been given by the people at the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science is to, at the very least, make the data file of the variables for a particular paper public, so you don't have to publish the entire data set, but the ones for that particular project. So say in one paper you use 5 variables, so you can put just those 5 variables on the Open Science Framework, for example, and share just those. But then again, I would also supplement that with the entire variable list as well. So not only what if you don't want to do these things, but what if you just can't? So what if you can't share your data? So this might be because you didn't include it in your participant's consent form. I've actually have only started doing this recently because technically you have to have participants, at least in psychology, their permission to share their data openly and publicly. So if you don't have that, then can you technically share that publicly? It depends. And so in any scenario you can think of, if you can't share your data or your materials for whatever reason, then don't. As scientists, particularly scientists that work with human participants, our utmost responsibility is to those participants. And so we should never do anything that compromises their information, especially if they don't give us permission to do so. And so whenever possible, it's great that we share our materials, it's great that we share our data, but if we can't, then we can't. And this has also been recognized in various outlets, at least in psychology. So in one of our top journals, Psych Science, they actually have a protocol for this because they're also one of the people or one of the journals that go into the badges. So they have the Open Science, so the Preregistration, Open Data, and Open Materials badges. And so if you submit to this journal, for example, they will ask you, do you want to apply for these badges? But if you can't say, for example, share your data, they'll just ask you for a rationale as to why. It doesn't matter what your rationale is, they just ask that you provide a rationale for that. So I think that's really important because it shouldn't be, I feel like there's like a little bit of a misconception that, we just have to be open all the time, but there are cases where we just can't be, especially when we have sensitive information. So at the very least, we need to protect our participants' data. So does anyone have any other questions like this? Like any sort of questions that would demystified? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to know if first, you said that it's possible to, put data from Box or Dropbox, on OSF.
Yeah.
Is it possible to put encrypted data? That will,
What do you mean by encrypted data?
encrypted.
You mean if you put a password on the data?
As long as you do not share it, it's encrypted. Even those who are on this, this platform have no right to see. They even can't.
Yeah.
Get access to
Yeah, I think you definitely can do that. Because one thing that because I've also been thinking about this a lot lately, because at least in my field, there's kind of a joke where, people don't share their data. They're like, oh, just ask me. But that just is code for don't ever ask me because I will never email you back. So something I've been kind of toying around with this idea. So how do we actually sort of get around that? So one thing that I've kind of come up with is that you can either encrypt your data, and then you can say, if you want access to this data, contact me and I'll give you the password for that, and that way you can still kind of choose who gains access to it, but it's still open so that people can easily find it, so it's not just hidden in your file drawer. I think someone talked about this in a talk recently where, it goes the file drawer is really just a trash can. So at least it's the data is out there, so people know that they can access it, and then you can just give access to whoever you want to. So I think that's perfectly okay. And a similar thing that I've kind of thought about was you can make, for example, the data component private, and then you can say in the wiki, if you're interested in getting access to this data, contact me, and then you can add them as a contributor so that only certain people have access to the data.
The second part of my question is it possible, given that, we have been talking about sensitive data, is it possible to anonymize the data? Just post there, but it's anonymized so that, we even do not know which country, what people...
Yeah, so I often routinely anonymize my data, so I typically remove any email addresses that I use. Those have a random code, 1 through 100 or whatever it might be, or maybe something completely random. I guess with the sensitive information, it's more even if you remove the very obvious demographics, or their name, their email address, sometimes you can still kind of figure out who's who depending on the sample. So like I said, if a couple participated in a study together, like in a relationship study, if someone knows what their responses are, obviously, they can find the data technically in theory, and like, you know, once they find their data and they're matched to their partners, they can easily find their partner's data. So like, even though it's technically not listed who's who, like there's still ways to figure out people's responses. So it's in those like kind of more abstract cases that I'm talking about in terms of sensitivity. But in terms of like anonymizing it, in terms of giving them random codes, like yeah, that's totally fine.
I mean, the case you are explaining, maybe because probably the anonymization was not like done properly. Because like when you anonymize, I mean, you want to keep things like together, and then you'll make sure that even using like some pieces of information, we cannot combine them and identify.
Yeah.
I mean, the specific person.
Well, it depends, because in that example that I just gave with the couples data, they typically need to be linked, because you usually compare responses, at least like I'm not a relationship scientist, so like I can't speak about it too much, but say typically you would want to compare responses between the two partners, and so in some way they do need to be linked, because you need to know that these two people are a partner. And so if it's more of like once a person knows, because they clearly say I did it with my partner, I know what my responses are, so once I find out what my responses were, and because it's linked, I can easily see what my partner's responses were. And that can get kind of problematic in cases where, you know, they're asking like personal questions about their partners. Another colleague of mine in my department, he studies like intergroup and terrorism. So even though he might anonymize certain remove names and things like that, depending on the types of responses that they get, or maybe how they recruit certain participants, it might be easy to identify those people on other characteristics. And so that's where you can kind of be a bit more selective and say you can kind of remove those sensitive pieces of information and share them on an as-needed basis, is what I would recommend. Yeah.
Sorry, if the registry is searchable and how?
Yes, it actually is. So you can find other people's. You can also search projects in general. So you can gain access to other people's projects if they made them public. Yeah, there's the whole database is pretty much open. I think it's like if you keep them private. I don't remember if they show up or not, but you just won't be able to access them. But yeah,
And is
but.
it based on the title or are there keywords?
So I think you can do it by tags and title. I think you can also search particular researchers if you want. You can also click on someone's profile. So if you have like a favorite researcher in mind, you can go to their profile, see what their projects are, what they've shared. So yeah, you can gain access to other people's stuff. So especially if you're looking for data to use, for example, you can look up certain data sets with certain keywords, things like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a really quick question. So you mentioned that if you wanted to share the data, you would just invite somebody to contribute to the project.
Yeah.
Is there a limit in how long they could be added as a contributor?
You would have to remove them.
Okay.
So you can selectively add. So if you add someone to a project, you can limit them to however you see fit. So you can add them to the entire project, or you can also just add them to certain components as well. You can also do, I think, view only, things like that. People can edit things. So there's a little bit more customizability with how contributors can actually play around with your components in your projects. But if you do want to remove them, you will have to manually remove them from it.
So there's a specific time frame that you would give them and you would have to remove them?
No. Yeah. But I guess at that point, if you're adding them to take the data, they can download the data and they can remove themselves and they'll still have the data. So. So once you kind of give access, and that's, to me, it's no different than, say, a researcher emails you and says, I want access to your data, will you give it to me? You can say yes or no via email, and if you say yes, you email them the file. It's the same thing, in my opinion. It's just, in this way, the file is located in a public space. People know where it's at. It's not going to get like lost in your treasure trove of Dropbox or anything like that. It's organized. You know where it's at. People know where it's at if they need it for whatever reason. If you need it for whatever reason, you can share it with your collaborators. You can invite new people. So it's a way to make your data more organized and more easily accessible, both to you and to potential contributors.
The last question is, if I'm working already in collaboration with other authors on Dropbox, and then I download, I link my Dropbox file to the OSF, would I also have to manually add my co-authors as contributors, or is that done?
Within Dropbox, I don't know. I haven't done that yet, so I'm not sure. But we can play around with that later on, and I can get back to you on that. Yeah.
After you've registered, is there an indication when the study is published?
What do you mean by the studies published?
Like once the research has been published,
Oh, so like the actual paper itself?
Yeah.
So, I don't think so. At least not. It doesn't like within the registration. Like it doesn't automatically say like this paper is now published. You can upload it. You can attach a manuscript to it through a preprint though. So, for example, I've actually done this recently for a paper that I did. I pre-registered my study, and then I uploaded the paper as a preprint to Psych Archive. There's various different versions of these archives for different fields, but I uploaded it to Psych Archive, and then I attached it to my my project. And so within that project, there's a component that has the paper in it. So you can do that yourself. Any other questions? So just to sort of wrap up, I have a couple just take-home messages. One thing that I personally like to stress is that, yes, we can pre-register our studies, but there's still flexibility within that. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the dynamic documents. You can sort of change things as you see fit. And I think that's really important because depending on the people you're talking to, which field you're in, there's this idea that if we have to be perfect all the time and that we can't make mistakes. But as scientists, especially as a student scientist, I make mistakes all the time. I'm still learning. I might learn a new stats analysis tomorrow that I want to change to or something like that. You never know. And so the key thing here is to just keep track of anything that you do throughout the research process. So even if you deviate from your initial pre-registration, that's okay, just document it. Another thing that I like to stress is the security aspect. Yes, ideally we would like to share our data, we would like to share our materials whenever possible, but sometimes we can't. So you do have some control over that. So you're saying with the different types of security you can do with data management. So just keep that in mind. And again, if you cannot share your data or whatever, that's okay too. Just justify it. And I would also say that I would argue that it's never okay to not share your data in the sense that if someone asks you for it, you probably should share it. Because then if you're kind of just like hoarding your data to yourself, that gets kind of sketchy. So try not to do that. And then I guess at the core of all of this, at least for me, is that just be honest. Whatever you do, just be honest with yourself. Be honest with the scientific community. If you make changes, just acknowledge them. Don't say your hypothesis. Don't change your hypothesis just because it doesn't fit your results. It's becoming more common that's being more acceptable. So just be honest with yourself. Be honest with your reviewers. Be honest with your community. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to talk with anyone throughout the next few days. If you have more specific questions, I can show you different functions. If you want to learn how to maybe add the different components, just let me know. I'll be around, and I'm happy to sit down and chat with anybody about it. Oh, sorry.
Is there a manual for OSF?
There must be some, I don't know if there's an official one, but there are a lot of different versions of kind of the presentation that I've just given. So I can compile a few of the ones that I particularly like, and I can send them out as well.